Hello, welcome to another book report. Have a big, complex, interesting book. A lot of information in here. The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. So, I am probably not going to go over all of my notes on this book. It's just too big. There's so much going on. If you're into archaeology, anthropology, anything like that, I would highly recommend it. It basically covers newer information, newer discoveries, which challenges a lot of the assumptions people have been making for hundreds of years, particularly about the so-called agricultural revolution, which was more of a extremely slow process with lots of back and forth. And in fact, many cases, like in North America, where thousands of years of agricultural activity actually receded into a more dominant hunting-gathering mode of survival. So, and feeding themselves. So, anyway, would recommend it for anyone interested in those sorts of debates. Their angle, the only annoying bit is that they think modern humans are stuck, right? They don't give any real evidence for this. They apparently assume that it's self-evident that modern humans are stuck, and that the wealthy people in the wealthy nations live in this horrible hierarchical unfree world. I strongly disagree. I mean, yes, there's economic inequality. Yes, it's bigger than any time since the first Gilded Age, maybe even bigger. But for me, it's the bottom, right? I want to raise up the bottom. I don't really care. I mean, there are issues. Anyway, but those attitudes only creep in a couple times. It's mildly annoying. I just kind of ignore it. The information they're giving, though, is really fascinating and interesting. Okay, so let's jump right into the quotes here. Let's see here, 247. So here's a good summary of some of their main points. I mean, like I said, it's a big book. They've got a lot of stuff. So it will by now be increasingly obvious to any reader that almost nothing about this established narrative matches the available evidence, meaning the agricultural revolution leading to hierarchy and inequality. That nothing about that narrative matches the available evidence. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, long regarded as the cradle of the, quote, agricultural revolution, close quote, there was in fact no switch from Paleolithic forager to Neolithic farmer. The transition from living mainly on wild resources to a life based on food production took something in the order of 3,000 years. And while agriculture allowed for the possibility of more unequal concentrations of wealth, in most cases this only began to happen millennia after its inception. In the centuries between, people were effectively trying farming on for size, play farming, if you will, switching between modes of production, much as they switched their social structures back and forth. So, and they provide a lot of compelling archaeological and anthropological evidence to support that. Then we jump to 171. So, yeah, I thought this was good too. And this expands it beyond the Fertile Crescent, basically. So, in fact, farming of this particular sort, low-level food production is the more technical term, has characterized a very wide range of Heliocene societies, including the earliest cultivators of the Fertile Crescent and Mesoamerica. In Mexico, domestic forms of squash and maize existed by 7000 BC, yet these crops only became staple foods around 5,000 years later. Similarly, in the eastern woodlands of North America, local seed crops were cultivated by 3000 BC, but there was no serious farming until 1000 AD. China follows a similar pattern. Millet farming began on a small scale around 8000 BC on the northern plains as a seasonal complement to foraging and dog-assisted hunting. It remained so for 3,000 years, until the introduction of cultivated millets into the basin of the Yellow River. Similarly, on the lower and middle reaches of the Yangtze, fully domesticated rice strains only appear 15 centuries after the first cultivation of wild rice in paddy fields. It might have even taken longer were it not for a snap of global cooling around 5000 BC, which depleted wild rice stands and nut harvests. So, and then it gets into interesting how the domestication of animals also, there's evidence that it also is a very gradual process, including the fact that in the Fertile Crescent, the Middle East, what we call the Middle East now, there's strong evidence that for hundreds of years only female pigs were domesticated, and not even all the female pigs, just a couple female. They would basically pin a couple female pigs, and let the male pigs and other females run around, and then just keep those couple females around. Who would also interact with the wild pigs, so sort of semi-wild. Anyway, I found that fascinating. I'd never heard of that before. And now we jump to 382. And then now we get into their critique in terms of social relations, not just the agricultural revolution. And I thought this was a good summary, so I'll read this one as well. Okay, so what is true of time, incidentally, is also true of space. For the last 5,000 years of human history, i.e. roughly the span of time we will be moving around in over the course of this chapter, our conventional vision of world history is a checkerboard of cities, empires, and kingdoms. But in fact, for most of this period, these were exceptional islands of political hierarchy surrounded by much larger territories, whose inhabitants, if visible to historians' eyes, are variously described as tribal confederacies, amphitysonies, whatever, that's a word to me, or, if you're an anthropologist, segmentary societies, that is, people who systematically avoided fixed, overarching systems of authority. We know a bit about how such societies worked in parts of Africa, North America, Central and Southeast Asia, and other regions where such loose and flexible political associations existed into recent times, but we know frustratingly little of how they operated in periods when these were by far the world's most common forms of government. So, although common in terms of area, I don't know about common in terms of population, because hunting gathering in some places can support significant populations, but nothing like an intensive agricultural society. So, yes, maybe more common in terms of geography, physical geography, but maybe not so common in terms of per capita or percentage of population. So they don't really get into that. Anyway, but I love that. I love that imagery. So, that the cities, empires, and kingdoms are these. How do they put it? Exceptional islands of political hierarchy, surrounded by much larger territories of relative political freedom, or at least less hierarchical for the most part. Although we do know that some of these quote unquote more free cultures were definitely not very free, right? There were some pretty horrible hunter-gatherer groups for sure. We know that. So they should not be idolized. That's for sure. Okay, now we go to 492. Oh yeah, and then this is another big part of their book. They argue, well, I'll let them speak for themselves. It was precisely this combination of such conflicting ideological possibilities and, of course, the Iroquoian penchant for prolonged political argument that lay behind what we have called the Indigenous critique of European society. It would be impossible to understand the origins of its particular emphasis on individual liberty, for instance, outside that context. Those ideas about liberty had a profound impact on the world. In other words, not only did indigenous North Americans manage almost entirely to sidestep the evolutionary trap that we assume must always lead eventually from agriculture to the rise of some all-powerful state or empire, but in doing so they developed political sensibilities that were ultimately to have a deep influence on Enlightenment thinkers, and through them are still with us today. In this sense, at least, the Wendat won the argument. The Wendat are a culture group in what we now call Canada, where there's compelling evidence that several of their leaders, at least thought leaders, heavily influenced some influential Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, and therefore that's the connection with Enlightenment. Anyway, it would be impossible for a European today, or anyone really, whatever they actually thought, to take a position like that of 17th century Jesuits and simply declare themselves opposed to the very principle of human freedom. Of course, what the Jesuits of 300 plus years ago were talking about was more in line of like their conception of God and fate and all that. Anyway, I think they're kind of misinterpreting those Jesuit quotes, like they do many things. But anyway, they're basically arguing that North American conceptions of freedom have permeated the world and I agree, and not just through European Enlightenment thinkers, also North American via our political and philosophical history, not the least of all the Constitution of the United States, which is definitely was influenced by some of the political arrangements in the northeastern United States among the natives. There's no question. It's not taught as widely as it should be, but there's no question that that's true, in my mind anyway. Okay, and then another compelling piece of this book is the way that they frame freedom. So I'm going to just read this short quote about how they define freedom. So they kind of they break up into three basic pieces. One, in terms of basic forms of social liberty. So one, the freedom to move away or relocate from one's surroundings. Two, the freedom to ignore or disobey commands issued by others. And three, the freedom to shape entirely new social realities or shift back and forth between different ones. So, and then they argue that we are stuck, right? So it's clear that something about human societies has changed here, and quite profoundly. The three basic freedoms have gradually receded to the point where a majority of people living today can barely comprehend what it might be like to live in a social order based on them. How did it happen? How did we get stuck? And just how stuck are we really? This is what I mentioned earlier about some of their assumptions. I love their framing of freedom. Movement to disobey commands of others, and to shift and create new social realities and shift between them. But I strongly disagree that modern humans can't do that, particularly in the wealthier countries. I mean, Western Europe, North America, there are countless subcultures. There are people creating their, how do they put it? To shape entirely new social realities. There are people creating totally new social realities all the time. there's just so many subcultures, uh, and people can float around and go in and out of them and try different social arrangements all the time. And you basically don't have to listen to anyone except the rule of law. I mean, which in most of the wealthy countries is relatively reasonable, right? I mean, particularly since uh, you know, I mean, I will. It's not perfect. People with darker skin, particularly in the United States, have a tough time, and everywhere. I mean, there's prejudice, um, but in general, with effort and time and applying yourself, you can make yourself almost whatever you want in North America or Western Europe. So I strongly disagree, and you can move almost anywhere. Again, with time and effort. I mean, it's not, but that was true in the ancient world too. He makes it sound like that those freedoms are so great. I mean, it's like an ancient North American could not move to Europe, right? They could not move into a culture that was wildly different, you know, somewhat different, but not wildly different. And it's not like, anyway, I I'll get off my soapbox here and get back to the book. And then 507. Oh, 507. Oh, yeah. Okay, and then another really interesting framework they use, which I really love, is a way of describing different societies in terms of how they apply power. So the state as we know it today results from a distinct combination of elements: sovereignty, bureaucracy, and a competitive political field, which have entirely separate origins. In our thought experiment of 2 chapters ago, let's just skip through here. All right. Ancient political systems, especially those such as the Olmec or Chevin de Huntor, that elude definition in terms of chiefdoms and states, can often be understood better in terms of how they developed one axis of social power to an extraordinary degree. The 3 axes being sovereignty, bureaucracy, and competitive political field, or charisma, if you will. So they kind of define first order states as one in which only one of those pillars or axes of social power is developed. So either charismatic political contests or and spectacles in the Olmec case, which is a Mesoamerican, what's in now Mexico, or control of esoteric knowledge, as in the Chevin, which is a society that was gone by the time Europeans got to North America, but existed in the Mississippi valleys, the Mississippi River Valley system. And these are what are termed first order regimes. So, and then where 2 axes of power were developed and formalized into a single system of domination, we can begin to talk of second order regimes. The architects of Egypt's Old Kingdom, for example, armed the principle of sovereignty with a bureaucracy and managed to extend it across a large territory. By contrast, the rulers of ancient Mesopotamian city-states made no direct claims to sovereignty, which for them resided properly in heaven. When they engaged in wars over land or irrigation systems, it was only as secondary agents of the gods. Instead, they combined charismatic competition with a highly developed administrative order. The classic Maya were different again, confining administrative activities largely to the monitoring of cosmic affairs, while basing their earthly power on a potent fusion of sovereignty and interdynastic politics. And then, of course, third order kingdoms combine all 3, basically modern nation states. Anyway, those 3 axes of social power or social social organization is a fascinating way of framing it that I've not really seen before. I'm sure they've got it from somewhere, although I didn't see it in their footnotes as to where they got that from. So that kind of sums up the book. I do have a lot of other bookmarks here, but I think I'll kind of skip most of these. I will read one section here where they critique, and I think this is one of the few valid critiques. They do critique Harari in his book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, which I'm going to reread here actually and review in a little bit, but within a month or two. But this critique I found compelling. I think a lot of their other critiques are misunderstanding the nuances, just like some of their other quotes are, I think, slightly not put in context quite right. But this is compelling. Anyway, so this is a quote from Harari's book, *Sapiens*. The socio-political world of the Forge is another area about which we know next to nothing. Scholars cannot even agree on the basics, such as the existence of private property, nuclear families, and monogamous relationships. It's likely that different bands had different structures. Some may have been as hierarchical, tense, and violent as the nastiest chimpanzee group, while others were as laid-back, peaceful, and lascivious as a bunch of bonobos, meaning fornicating, partying, kind of. So anyway, basically, we don't know anything about the early hunter-gatherer groups that existed for most of human, or what we assume is hunter-gatherer groups, for most of early human history. But anyway, so not only was everyone living in bands, which isn't necessarily true, until farming came along, but these bands were basically ape-like in character. If this seems unfair to the author, remember that Harari could just as easily have written, quote, as tense and violent as the nastiest biker gang, close quote, and, quote, as laid-back, peaceful, and lascivious as a hippie commune, close quote. One might have imagined the obvious thing to compare one group of human beings with would be another group of human beings. Why then did Harari choose chimps instead of bikers? It's hard to escape the impression that the main point of difference is that bikers choose to live the way they do. Such choices imply political consciousness, the ability to argue and reflect about the proper way to live, which is precisely, as Bohm reminds us, what apes don't do. Yet Harari, like so many others, chooses to compare early humans with apes anyway. So I disagreed with a lot of their other critiques and observations of other writers of early prehistory or late prehistory, but that one I found compelling and interesting. We know that sometime around 70,000 years ago, there was I'm sure it was gradual, but there was also it wasn't super gradual, but there was a neurological revolution, right, in terms of Homo sapiens brains. So that those late prehistory groups were at least in physically at least were mentally just like us, physically just like us, in terms of their potential and abilities. So I think that's a legitimate criticism that he should be comparing late prehistory groups of humans to other modern humans, not apes, right? Not because their social arrangements are often chosen, right? Or at least semi-chosen, at least by leaders or thought leaders, cultural leaders, right? At the very least. So I thought that was a legitimate criticism. And I have a lot of other bookmarks here, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. I've covered the basics of their arguments, and would recommend it to anyone who wants to learn more about late prehistory into the development of human societies in general, and social arrangements, all that. Again, my only main criticism is that I think they shortchange modern humans and our ability to create new social arrangements and experiment and exercise freedom, which I think most wealthy countries, most people in most wealthy countries have a lot of freedom, including movement and creating new social arrangements and to disobey orders, right? You know, except for the rule of law, which, like I said, in most wealthy countries, pretty reasonable, I think. Anyway, good book. Until the next book report, happy reading.